just after the election, there was just an election, in case you didn't know, yeah. Just after I posted this on Facebook, today of all days, I wrote, we need to heed this ancient wisdom. And I offered a few quotes of well-known pieces of Talmudic teachings. The point that I was trying to make was perhaps better articulated by my friend and colleague, Pastor Clarence Moore, who wrote, "You are awakening to the same country you fell asleep to. Pull yourself together." He would not have recognized the Talmudic quotes that I chose, which date back 2,000 years, but both of those texts addressed the intensity of emotion that was felt on all sides of this very important election. Pastor Moore's text obviously was written for a particular audience, many of whom might have felt betrayed, angered, bewildered by the results of Tuesday. I recognize that not everyone felt this way after the election results were announced, but the questions that Pastor Moore, who is himself a powerful African-American Baptist preacher, answered in his writing, they are very relevant for us all. "When you see me," he wrote, "do not ask me, what do we do now? For some of my ancestors dealt with at least 400 years of far worse conditions." He challenged us to consider this week in a very different frame. God demands of us, he argued, to, quote, do the good work, build bridges, not walls, to lead with compassion, to continue to demand the work of liberation for all, to dismantle broken systems, to set the best example for the children, to continue, in his words, right where you are, right where you live into your days. Another friend and pastor at Second Presbyterian across the street, Chris Henry, he wrote something also I found profound. He wrote, "Our work remains the same, and no one else will do it for us." And in the language of his tradition, he added, "Those of us who claim and are claimed by faith have a burden of responsibility." His challenge to us all, and to his parishioners in particular, was to continue to denounce rhetoric or action that denies the image of the sacred in any person, to teach our own children and all entrusted to our care that compassion is not weakness but strength, that morality matters, and that no success is worth the betrayal of our values. These ideas are not revolutionary, nor are they unique to this historical moment, but they are the best, most appropriate response to the tearing apart of the fabric of society, even when it only begins to fray. And in our tradition, the most famous of those expressions, which has held our fabric together, quite literally, has always been this from the Torah: love your neighbor as yourself. Judaism knows no greater phrase. Rabbi Akiva, the famous Talmudic sage, even goes so far as to call it the greatest principle of the Torah, klal gadol b'Torah. So tonight, in addition to exploring these words by my esteemed friends, I wanted us to have an opportunity to explore what this phrase actually means and how we might use these words in the coming days to help us all move past the election and begin to prepare for the next steps of rebuilding trust and relationship. What is it that the Torah is asking for when it commands us to love? Can we really be commanded in any form to love, especially to care about those with whom we feel we have little in common? Objectively, though, can we obligate ourselves to feel something anything at all. Many would argue that since emotions cannot be controlled by the brain, they cannot be commanded, and therefore this specific command poses a bit of an intellectual challenge. There is one interesting note on the verse that might prove useful to us. It notes that the Hebrew does not actually say, as we generally translate it, love your neighbor, which would be ve'ahavta et re'echa, connoting a direct object. Instead, we read ve'ahavta le're'echa, using the preposition le. Rabbi Shai Held suggests the crude translation of not love your neighbor, but rather he says love to your neighbor, towards your neighbor. Crude. Scholars have speculated, as they will, about the meaning of this curious phrase. One suggests that this is the way in which the Bible is attempting to be pragmatic and concrete about what it is that we are commanded to do. It would not be enough, suggests this scholar, simply to love one another. But instead, we should be offering useful support to one another. We might say a better translation would be useful to your neighbor as you are to yourself. And in this way, the verse isn't speaking about emotions at all, but in general, asking us to be helpful people to the people around us. On the other hand, several scholars argue, indeed, that the Torah does claim to tell us how to feel. So directly before this curious imperative to love one another, we are commanded not to hate one another, not to take vengeance on one another, not to bear a grudge against one another. Is it really so difficult, argue the sages, to imagine that we are actually commanded to love? And why would the Torah over and over again evoke a communal memory of Egypt when asking us to love? Remember the stranger, for you were once strangers in the land of Egypt. If not to remind us that what is required in order to fulfill these commandments is an emotion. It is an emotion of compassion. You were once slaves in Egypt. You know what it is to become the other. Therefore, you will have a special responsibility to care for the other, your neighbor, strangers even, immigrants, and even those outside of your own community, to love them as yourself. I have not known a time of more bitter division in America in living memory. The 24-hour media cycle reminds us constantly of the boundaries we have placed between one another. We feel the intractability of political party, of gender gaps, of wage and wealth disparities. We are entombed in echo chambers of I am right and you are wrong. And if I were to actually ask us tonight to define a simple term such as, who do you consider your neighbor to be? You might accurately retort to me that even your neighbors don't particularly feel like neighbors all of the time. Now, there have been those who have always read into these texts a particular self-righteousness, arguing that the sages must have only been speaking about the Jews. We care for our own, even when in the Torah it uses phrase like neighbor or fellow or friend. The beauty of this text can only fully emerge when we acknowledge that there is a question, a challenge embedded within it. Who do you consider your neighbor to be? Would that name only apply to families living on your street or in your building, Is it only those people to your right and your left whose name you know and whose stories you share? On the other hand, why put any limitations on the term at all? For the sages, this is a real question. They argue that a neighbor has nothing at all to do with address and everything to do with your worldview. Do not stand idly by the blood of your re'echa. Ve'ahavta re'echa kamocha. Love your re'echa, your neighbor, like yourself. Or perhaps we should say, love them like your own family. In reality, these texts are calling us to something much higher than ensuring that we know the ones who run our homeowners associations. We are challenged first by the notion that we are to love ourselves, to place our own needs first, and yet to also love others, and to place the needs of others as our own first. We are obligated as Jews to reach across divides, all of the divides, and to bring others into our circle of family and friends, to love strangers, not to forget them, to consider them all our neighbors, and to show those with whom we disagree the respect, the curiosity, the admiration that we ourselves aspire to, and ultimately to love them, to search our hearts for the capacity to engage with one another enough to love. I know that this is a tall order for those of us who feel entirely betrayed and afraid of what this election means for us all. And yet, as Pastor Moore reminds us, the work doesn't change. We are still working toward the same goals we shared yesterday and last week and last year. The world is not more broken than it was. Our awareness has just increased a little bit. The work which lies before us, that much more clearly laid out. Pastor Chris Henry ends his talk by reminding us that we all have choices and that God has work for us to do, all of us. On this Shabbat, I pray that we take those messages seriously. Jewish values have never meant more for our society than they will in the coming months and the coming years. As I included in my own post this week, it is not up to you to complete the task. It is also not for you to abandon it. It will soon be time to get to work. Shabbat Shalom.